Is there a tension between kind of the left, the progressive wealth redistribution kind of ideas with the idea of building that's primarily sort of getting out of the way and letting the market get the job done?
Let's say two things on that. So, one, we think there's a real tension between equality, redistribution, and constricting the supply of specifically housing.
So housing, by the way, I would love to understand this. That's the big problem of our era.
Housing and energy, I think, are the two most significant that we focus on in the book, right? Housing and clean energy. We don't have enough housing, we don't have enough clean energy. I would add things to that. Public infrastructure. We don't really focus that much on education, but we could, and we could talk about that. Immigration is probably there for me too, and we talk about that a little bit in the book. And we do talk a lot about how to pull innovation forward from the future. But when you ask about sort of redistribution, I really think this is an important point because there's a great new paper by David Schleicher, and I'm so sorry because I'm forgetting his co-author. They're law professors, though, and they talk about the victory of gentry law. We used to have a law that was very dynamic when it came to property and land. It was very different than how things were in Britain. And over time, sort of back half of the 20th century, we moved American law to be much more for what they call the gentry. We moved it much more towards protecting those who currently have things, right? And we do that through a million things, covenants and HOAs and all these sort of contracts we make people enter into so they can't even build on their own land. But one of the things that just happens when you constrict the supply of housing is that people who got in when the getting was good, it's a classic story in New York and LA and in SF. You bought a place in 1977 for $220,000 and now it's worth $2.7 million. And maybe you'll pass it on to your kids or you sell it. But the working class families can't afford to live there anymore, right? So that's not even a question of redistribution. Sometimes what you need in order to create the possibilities for opportunity and mobility is enough supply of the thing. At the same time, we don't think like that redistribution is the problem here. I'm pro redistribution. I'm pro more redistribution than we currently do. But to give one example, the way these can be great days to go together, Derek tells in the book at some great length the story of Operation Warp Speed. And here you have in the mRNA vaccines, technology that was critically funded by public money, specifically DARPA at different points. Then hastened, after COVID, government through Operation Warp Speed under Donald Trump, really tried to clear out regulatory cruft, move these things really fast. But the demand on the side of the public for having funded so much of this, for having made so much possible, was that when these vaccines hit, they were going to be free. Maybe the most important medical advance of that entire era. And it wasn't going to be like Ozempic, say, where it's, $15,000 for a year of doses, right? It wasn't going to be only available to the richest people at the beginning. We were going to try to give it to everybody, sorted by need to the best that we could, and it would be free. Now, you're not going to do that with everything, right? There are places for the price signal to actually function and where it can function to then bring on more supply later. And, there's all the Econ 101 stuff that we all know. But there are a lot of places where redistribution and supply increases go hand in hand. Another good example, I've done over the course of my career a huge amount of work on health insurance reform and universal health care. And let's say you got, Bernie Sanders had become president in 2016 and had swept in a huge Democratic majority, and they passed Bernie's single payer for all plan, which was, by the way, much more expansive than any existing single payer plan in the world, right? It covered much more than Canada's or the UK's or anybody else. If you had done that, what you would have needed immediately was a huge supply increase in healthcare because you would have had a huge demand increase. What happens if you make healthcare free? People are going to use more of it. If you make insurance much more widespread, people are going to go to the doctor more often. Well, if you don't have enough doctors, you don't have enough nurses, you don't have enough surgeons, you need more. We constrict the supply of all those things using residency rules, using nursing rules, immigration rules, who can practice as a nurse practitioner, what can a nurse practitioner actually do. You have to be attentive to the supply side, even if what you're doing is aggressive redistribution. Now, there are places where these things don't conflict. Like, I'd like to see a much expanded child tax credit, and I don't think that has a big supply side implication one way or the other. But on a lot of the things we're talking about, even if what you want to do, and it is often what we want to do more redistribution, if you're redistributing some kind of thing that gives you access to a good or a service, you need to expand the good or the service. We do rental vouchers. Giving people rental vouchers in the San Francisco housing market, unless you build more housing, just creates something that our friends at the Niskanen Center call cost disease socialism, where you are increasing demand for a good at which you've constricted supply. If you do that, you're just going to drive the price up. To some degree, that's at least part of the story of higher education. We give people Pell Grants, we give people all kinds of subsidies for higher ed, but we have not done nearly enough to increase supply or regulate the way in which colleges just then pocket part of that money. And so they're building these fancy gyms and they're competing with each other, but they're not actually increasing the supply of slots. It's just certainly not the level we want them to. So there's a lot here where I think it scrambles traditional categories. You cannot do effective redistribution in ways that we would like to see them done, and many people on the left would like to see them done, if you're not taking supply of the thing that you're subsidizing seriously.
If you think about it from a first principle standpoint, what if what you wanted to do was to bring American poverty as close to 0.0% as you possibly could? You got a bunch of smart people into a room. You said, what can we possibly do? In my opinion, the answer would include a lot of what are sometimes called demand-side policies, a lot of redistribution of income. The child tax credit, I think, would be essential. Expanding the earned income tax credit would be essential. Expanding cash welfare might be essential. Certainly redistributing income from the rich to the poor would be essential. These are demand-side policies. They're tax and spending policies. But if you only approach this subject through the demand side, you will utterly and categorically fail. Because like we said, housing is the biggest part of a typical family's budget. And if your only policy on housing is to increase housing vouchers without increasing the supply of housing, macroeconomically speaking, there's only one direction for housing prices to go, and it's straight up to the moon. You're not actually bringing housing prices down. You're just subsidizing a constricted market and therefore creating enormous inflation. You have to solve some of these problems on the supply side. And one of the conceptual scoops that Ezra and I are trying to work out for the left, for liberals in America, is to get people to ask the question, how do we solve this problem with supply? Housing is a crisis. How do we solve it with supply? Energy is a crisis. How do we solve it with supply? Medical innovation, scientific discovery is a massively interesting phenomenon. We don't even understand how it exists, really. Like, how do great discoveries actually happen? Is there a supply side policy for that as well? That's the question we're asking over and over in the book. So at the end of the day, demand side progressivism and what Ezra calls supply side progressivism really are peanut butter and chocolate. They are two flavors that go beautifully well together. But here's the problem that I think your question was putting your finger on. I think a lot of Americans don't believe that these things work together because what they see is a liberalism that just taxes and spends, and Americans don't see the benefits of that spending. The Biden administration authorized $42 billion to build rural broadband in America. Practically none of it was built. Authorized $7.5 billion to build EV charger stations in America. Practically none of it was built. How many tens of billions of dollars have been authorized to build high-speed rail in California? Practically none of it exists. You can't ride it. So the problem is when the reputation of a tax and spend liberal makes contact with the fact that people don't see the results in the physical world. Like, where's my money going? I have in my head something like this idea of what I call equinox liberalism, which is to say there's some forms of liberalism where it's very expensive, but you see what you're getting. Like when you spend $270 to go to Equinox for the month, right? It's a really expensive gym bill, but people who go there seem to love it. They're like, the equipment is always free. Everything is clean. I go into the locker room. There's a bunch of Kiehl's lotions to like put on my face after I shower. I am getting exactly what I'm paying for. Yes, I'll pay out the nose for a gym because I love seeing that money going to work. And in places like Sweden, Denmark, citizens seem very happy. They're paying much higher taxes than people are in America, but they're seeing where the money's going to work. The problem with a liberalism that blocks rather than builds is that people don't see the money going to work. All they see are the dollar signs being spent by government, and then they walk out of their house and they see collapsing infrastructure, and they see crime, and they see housing prices going to the moon. And so they think, wait, this social contract is broken down. You're asking for Equinox prices, but you're giving me a shit-ass gym. And that's unfair. And so what we're trying to say is, I mean, in a very serious way, because I'm not trying to be flippant about gyms. In a very serious way, what we're trying to say is a part of this problem is that you Democrats have looked so hard at the demand side of the ledger that you've forgotten how powerful the levers are on the supply side. And if we can just pull those levers on housing in particular, we can bring down the cost of living, and people might even support the tax and spend model more because they'll feel like they're participating in equinox liberalism and not its opposite.